Let's go over an example to see why there are conflicts between stockholders and bondholders. So in this example, there are two different projects. You have Project L and Project H. Project L is a low-risk project and Project H is a high-risk project, right? Let's try to recreate this example in Excel so that we can also do the work along with understanding why there is conflict between stockholders and bondholders. So let's move to Excel. So I've copied the same example and written it down in Excel to help us with the calculations. So let's first look at Project L. For Project L, which is the low-risk project, bondholders and stockholders each will invest $1,000, right? And then depending on how the economy is or how well the company performs, there is going to be different cash flow that the company is generating. So if the economy is good, the company will make overall $2,400. If the economy is bad, then the firm will make $2,000, right? So if the firm pursues this project, then they're looking at two different scenarios. Scenario one, where they make $2,400. In scenario good. In scenario bad, they're making $2,000. Say the bondholders have an interest of 8%. So regardless of how the company performs, the firm is obligated to pay its bondholders 8% along with its initial investment. So this would make it 1,000 times 1 plus 0.08. So 1,080. So the company would have to pay its bondholders 1,080 if the scenario is good. It would also have to pay 1,080 if the scenario is bad. All right. After paying the bondholders, what is left? That is going to go to the stockholders. So after paying the bondholders, what is left would go to the stockholders. So if the firm made 2,400, so let's remove how much was paid to the bondholders. So that's an E6. You see here, we'll minimize this a little so you can see the calculation, right? So 2,400 minus 1,080, so 1,320. That's what's remaining for the stockholders. Same thing here. In scenario bad, the company will make 2,000. 1,080 of that will go to the bondholders. That leaves only 920 for the stockholders. Okay. So bondholders, they're looking at 1,080 regardless of whether the economic condition is good or bad if the company takes on Project L. If the company takes on Project L, stockholders are looking at 1,320 or 920 depending on which scenario happens in the future. Okay. So next what we'll do is we're going to calculate the expected cash flow, which is basically given the probability of these scenarios, what is the likely amount, what is the average likely amount that the bondholders or the stockholders will receive. Okay, so that's your expected cash flow. So over here, since we don't know the probabilities with which scenario good and scenario bad will happen, we're going to assume that they are equally likely. So there's a 50% probability that the scenario will be good and a 50% probability that the scenario will be bad. So in a case like that, when you're calculating the expected cash flow, you can just take the average between the two scenarios, right? Or the average between the scenarios that you have, given that they're equally likely. So this would be equal to the average, and you can do this by hand too. Let me do the average for the bondholders. So this is equal to the average of, if you take the average of 1,080 and 1,080, it should be 1,080 because it's the same number. Okay. Now let's take the average between 1,320 and 920. Again, you don't need Excel to do this. You can do it yourself using a calculator or maybe in your mind, but it's just helpful to have it this way so you can, in the future, if you want to play around with the numbers, you can. Okay, so now we have our expected cash flow for the bondholders and the stockholders. The bondholders on an average would expect 1,080 from this project, regardless of which, like, for taking an average of the scenarios. Stockholders are looking at an expected cash flow of 1,120, right? So on an average, they can expect to receive 1,120. So that's what we have. So now let's look at what's the expected return. Okay. For the bondholder, so when you're before we go to that, to calculate expected return, we will look at how much the initial investment was, how much is the expected cash flow, and what proportion are they receiving, right? What proportion of return would bondholders and stockholders receive? Okay. In order to calculate the return, this will be equal to expected cash flow minus their initial investment, right, divided by their initial investment. So if you want to do this outside Excel, what you're seeing is the bondholders invested 1,000. They're expecting a cash flow of 1,080. So that means the additional cash flow in excess of their initial investment is 80. So 80 divided by 1,000. So that's the 8% return. Okay. We can change this to a percentage so we can see the actual percentage number. There you go. So bondholders in this project are expecting 8% return, whereas stockholders, let's see, they're expecting 1,120. Put your parentheses so you are doing the calculation correctly, minus their initial investment of 1,000 divided by the initial investment of 1,000, right? So basically this is 120 divided by 1,000, okay, leaving them with a 12% return. So if the firm pursues Project L, bondholders are looking at an average return of 8%, whereas stockholders are looking at the average return of 12%. Okay, right. Now let's replicate the same thing for Project H, which is the high-risk project. Okay. Bondholders and stockholders are still investing the same amount. Bondholders' interest is 8%. Okay. And the scenario for good or bad is equally likely. Right? So these probabilities don't change. The economy could be good or the economy could be bad. Right? If the economy is good in the high-risk project, the company will make $4,000 instead of $2,400 in Project L. But if the economy is bad, then the company will not make anything. Right? So they're looking at two extremes, either making $4,000 if the economy is good, or making nothing if the economy is bad. Okay, in this scenario, if they do take Project H, let's see what the bondholders and stockholders would receive in each of these scenarios. Okay. If the economy is good, again, it's an 8% interest. So the bondholders would receive 1,000 times 1 plus 0.08. Okay. So their initial investment of $1,080 in interest. Stockholders would receive what's left after paying the bondholders. So from this 4,000, the firm would pay the bondholders, leaving the stockholders with 2,920. Okay. Right. I just noticed that this is not 4,000. This is 4,400. There you go. Right. So this should be 4,400. We're paying the firm would pay the bondholders 1,080, leaving 3,320 for its stockholders. Okay. All right. Now let's move to scenario bad. In this case, the firm does not make anything. Right? If the firm doesn't make anything, then they don't have anything to pay their bondholders. So essentially, the bondholders will not receive anything. If the firm was in a loss, they don't have that 1,080 to pay back their bondholders. So in this scenario, the bondholders will receive 0. Again, there is nothing to pay their stockholders. So stockholders will also receive 0. So in this case, the expected cash flow, it's not an average of 1,080 and 1,080 like Project L, whereas in Project H, now the bondholders are looking at an average return of 1,080 and 0, so an average return of 540. Okay, we did the same thing, and you can follow shortcuts. I'm just showing all the steps here, so you can drag these formulas down if you need to, but I just want to show all the steps, so I'm going to go ahead and do each one of them. Okay, so now let's calculate the expected cash flow for stockholders. If scenario is good, they get 3,320. If scenario is bad, they receive 0. Right, so they are looking at an average return of, they're looking at an average expected cash flow of 1,660. Okay. It's higher because if the scenario is good, they make much more, right? So even with a case where they would receive 0, the average is still pretty high. Next, let's calculate the expected return. Okay, so remember the expected return, this is the difference between the expected cash flow minus initial investment, okay, divided by initial investment. Okay. Changing this to a percentage, this leaves the bondholders with an expected return of negative 46%, right? Because of this loss that might happen if the scenario is bad. So the expected return, instead of 8%, like Project L, is instead for negative 46%. Okay, let's calculate the expected cash flow for stockholders. Let's calculate the expected return for stockholders. So it's their expected cash flow minus initial investment divided by initial investment. Okay. There you go. Right, so stockholders on an average are looking at a return of 66%, and bondholders in Project H would receive an average return of negative 46%. So now let's see which projects the firm would, the bondholders and stockholders would prefer for the firm to choose, right? So if this is a bondholder, if you are a bondholder, if the company takes on Project L, there is greater certainty that the firm would pay back its bondholders, so it'll pay you back. So you would receive your 8% return, right? Regardless of what the scenario is, whether the scenario is good or bad, right? It's a low risk project. There is little difference between the cash flow that the firm would receive between good and bad. Okay? Compared to that, if the company takes on Project H, then the bondholders could be at a potential loss if the firm does not make any money, right? So they would not receive their initial investment, nor would they receive their interest. And they're looking at an expected return of negative 46%. So obviously, if you are a bondholder, you would prefer that the company take on the low risk project and give them a return of 8%. But stockholders don't have similar incentives, right? For stockholders, there is a potential gain for companies to take on higher risk projects. If the company takes on low risk project, they're looking at a 12% return, whereas the high-risk project would pay them 66% return on an average, right? So yes, there is a chance for making a loss, and stockholders would probably not want companies to keep on taking higher risk projects. But if we just compare it with bondholders, they have a higher tolerance for risk than bondholders because they would receive that additional amount in return, or they could potentially receive that. Right? So in a scenario like this, if you're looking between 12% and 66%, stockholders may prefer to take on project H because in this scenario, they are looking at an average return of 66%. Right? The loss, the potential scenario where they would not be making anything, is overcompensated by the fact that if the scenario is good, the stockholders will make much more. Okay, so just by looking at the simple example, we can see that there could be potential conflicts between stockholders and bondholders, where bondholders would prefer the company to take on lower risk projects, which give them a guarantee to receive their initial investments and their interest. Whereas stockholders, because they don't receive a fixed amount, their amount varies depending on the company's profitability. They might have a higher tolerance for risk and prefer the companies to take on riskier projects. Right? So this is a classic example of where you might see potential conflict between stockholders and bondholders. So bondholders, what they would do to protect their interest when they're writing their debt up, like their debt agreements or their bond agreements, they are going to put conditions that minimize the amount of risk that firms would take on. So basically saying, hey, if you want this loan, then you have to limit yourself. You cannot take on certain projects that are riskier in nature, that would put my loans at risk of defaulting, right? So they would put in, bondholders would put in these debt obligations that constrains a firm or minimizes the amount of risk that the firm could take.